Good evening and welcome. I call to order the November 20th, 2014 meeting of the City of Bellingham Planning Commission and ask everybody to silence all electronic devices before the meeting begins. That includes any drones that you happen to be flying in the room. Heather, would you please call a roll?
Tom Grinstead.
Here.
Jeff Brown.
Here.
Garrett O'Brien.
Here.
Ollie Taishi.
Here.
Phyllis McKee.
Here.
Steve Crooks.
Here.
Cerise Noah.
Here.
Great, thanks. We had minutes from the November 6th meeting distributed. I hope that everybody had a chance to read. Are there any corrections or comments? Do we have a motion?
I move that the minutes be approved as written.
I'll second.
It's been moved and seconded that the minutes from the November 6th meeting be approved as written. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Great. Next is the public comment period. At this time, we give the public an opportunity to speak to the commission on any subject other than the proposed amendments to Area 9 of the Samish Neighborhood Plan, which we will be considering tonight. So if you want to talk about Girl Scout cookies or anything else, you could have 3 minutes of free, unadulterated airtime to get your face on television. Anybody? Nobody. Okay, we'll close that part. Next is a work session, work session. We carried over the design review process update. And I guess, Chris, if you'd like to take it on.
Yes, as you said, the proposal for code amendments changing the design review process was carried over. At the last meeting, you requested some information of us, and we provided you with a memo last week. And per your request, we've provided you a comparison chart showing side by side the existing and proposed design review process for urban villages. That chart was additionally provided to anyone that provided public comment on that matter. And we have received no additional public comment on these proposed changes since the public hearing 2 weeks ago. We additionally, per your request, we have requested a letter from the Design Review Board supporting the changes, and we will be forwarding that to City Council with a council staff report. And we are not requesting a similar letter from the Historic Preservation Commission. That's because the proposed changes are consistent with the process that the Commission recently adopted for the Fairhaven Design Review District. And so basically, we used that process as a template for the proposed changes. Lastly, we ask that you recommend the proposed changes shown in the memo to be added to the recommendation section of the findings of fact, and those changes were showed to you at the end of the meeting last week. And those were largely just rearranging code sections. That's it right there.
Okay. Any comment, questions, concerns from the commission? Steve.
I just want to thank you for the chart, the flow chart. Extremely easy to read and understand. And I thank you very much for that. It's a great help. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and just as kind of an editorial aside, something like this would be helpful in the future with changes that we're going to be made, because just reading text is really boring to me anyway. Anybody else? Ollie.
Well, I missed the meeting 2 weeks ago, and I was disappointed because it was a topic that I participated, as Kurt noted, in one of the focus groups. But I did watch back the video, and so I kind of absorbed what everyone had to say, and then I was pleased when you guys extended it, so I could at least ask one or two questions. But I'm not going to take up a ton of time, because I know you guys deliberated and thought about this a lot. So just one question I had about this flowchart process. This is for city center and urban villages.
Right.
But do we have one, or do you have anything like this for just the regular multifamily design review process?
We don't, other than what's attached currently to our application forms.
The
But
form on the back?
it's staff review, so it doesn't
Yeah.
have these accessory meetings to the board or commission.
Okay. Well, I think it was really helpful, too, to see that, because it shows that it still respects the public input process, and you actually see like earlier public input, which is good. I think that's a good change in the process, but it also shows that we're cutting some time out. So, I mean, that's like two really great accomplishments making one change. My only other question is, on the regular multifamily design review process, I guess not so much a question as a statement. It doesn't look like we made any changes to that process. Is that fair to say?
Technically, no. We currently have a mayoral directive adopted that allows the director to refer a project to the board or commission for guidance or recommendation. That's just been formalized in this process.
Gotcha.
Actually, there is one change that, it's yet to be seen if it will be used, but it does give the applicant the option to send their project to the board or commission prior to application. So the applicant can ask that their project be reviewed by the board or commission prior to them making application. So not necessarily the director is referring it, but the applicant is asking for a review.
You would do that like after a pre-application meeting, then you could decide to go to the design review board or something
Right.
like that?
I think the only thing that I would add to that is that we are, as you know, we went through the first Kaizen event regarding the design review process. We also did that through the pre-application process. So one of our thoughts is that we will actually not require the technical pre-application conference for design review, because we're going to try and eliminate that step completely and just have the design guidance meeting with the board versus the staff technical meeting
For a multifamily one?
for all design review.
So you could, okay.
Anybody
That's
else? Well, then I guess we call the question. Do we have a motion?
I'll make the motion, but I foolishly forgot that particular packet with me, so I can't say anything other than something about adopting the findings, the facts, conclusions, and recommendations for that particular item. So if somebody can fill in the blanks?
Heather is filling in the blanks.
Well, I see that, but I don't have the actual document in front of me with the date. But I moved the amendments to the Bellingham Municipal Code Titles 20 and 21 to improve the design review process for new and existing development based on the lean process recommendations.
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any other discussion, concerns, questions? Jeff?
I just wanted to comment that the idea behind letting this season for a couple weeks was to respond to the public's request for additional time to digest it. And since there have been no additional written public comments, I feel comfortable that people have read it and people found it not worth their time to comment further on it. So I'm comfortable with this, and I think there's been an adequate public involvement for that. So I'm voting for it.
Anyone else?
Actually, I do have one, if we can just have a clarification that includes the changes in the memo. There's a couple extra 5 bulleted items in the memo that we're asking you to add to the draft findings. In fact, these are the ones that we discussed at the last hearing, though. They're not new.
They were on the last slide of the PowerPoint. Is that?
Right, correct.
As adjusted, as amended.
Okay.
Second?
It's been moved and seconded. And Ollie,
So I am going to support this too. I think it's a good change, and I look forward to you guys tackling more processes through this Kaizen method. I think it's a good change, and it does a lot of good things, and it doesn't sacrifice anything. But I wish we could have gone a little bit farther with it, because I know we don't get opportunities to take a look at these code updates like all the time. And I think I'm a little disappointed that we didn't get any changes in the regular multifamily process, because that's probably the one that is used most. I mean, there's a lot of property in Bellingham that has residential multi-development that's not in the city center, it's not in an urban village. So it would have been great to see, it's harder to squeeze fat out of that, I recognize, but it would have been great to try. And I hope that the concept of continuous improvement that Kaizen kind of believes in will stick with this, so we don't say, okay, let's put this on a shelf for 10 years and think it's great. I think we can constantly be learning from going through these processes and improving them. But that being said, I think this is a really great step forward, and I think it's not going to sacrifice anything from community involvement or anything else that's really important to the process. So I'm going to support it.
anyone else? Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? 7-0. The next item on the agenda is to amend the Samish neighborhood plan and the Bellingham Municipal Code to rezone Area 9 from commercial planned non-residential to commercial planned. And I will ask if anyone has interest in this, anyone on the commission has interest and wishes to recuse themselves.
Thank you, Tom. I do have an interest in this project, and so I'm going to step away from the commission and for this action. And because we have no other action after this, I'm just going to leave. So don't worry about coming out in the hallway to get me when you're done. Thank you.
Thanks, Ally. This particular rezone is south of the Elks Lodge and north of Community Baptist Church on the west side of Samish, between Samish Way and the freeway. We are going to amend our process a little bit and have the applicant do their presentation first.
Is this working? Great. Hi, thank you. I'm Scott Swanson with the Belcher Swanson Law Firm, 900 DuPont Street, Bellingham. I represent the applicant for this particular proposal, who is Upside Partnership. As was pointed out already, this property, I'm just going to give a quick little background on it. It is Area 9 of the Samish neighborhood. I don't have a PowerPoint, I'm not sure, but if you look at Exhibit A in your packet, there is a zoning map showing this particular location, and it is approximately 1.7 acres between I-5 and Samish Way, south of the Elks Lodge and north of the Community Baptist Church. Area 9 is currently zoned planned commercial, but it has a non-retail use qualifier, and then it has additional special regulations that restrict the use on the property to a very limited number of uses. And that's really why we're here today. Our proposal is to request both a comprehensive plan amendment as well as a rezone of the property. And the specific proposal is to remove the non-retail restriction from the planned commercial zone. This will allow the property to be developed with multifamily and a small commercial component, which is the intended, future development of the site. But the proposal is to convert it is to remove the non-retail designation. Your role as the Planning Commission is to look at the comprehensive plan amendment and rezone criteria and to make a recommendation to the City Council as to whether to approve the rezone and the comprehensive plan amendment. Those two criteria are found at BMC 20.20.040 and BMC 20.19.030, which requires certain criteria to be met for the approval of a comprehensive plan amendment and a rezone. One of the disadvantages of going first is I don't know exactly what's going to be said next. So the staff report, I think the staff will likely go into what's in the report some in terms of the specific criteria. So I'm going to leave that to staff's presentation, but I'm happy to address questions. I do think it was adequately presented in the materials that in the staff report that's already been presented. So I think they've done a good job and a thorough analysis of the identified facts that these criteria have been met. So we agree with the staff's analysis in this regard. I do want to hit a couple high points on the staff report. Specifically, if you the first criteria under 20.20.040 is that the proposed amendment is consistent with the Growth Management Act and other applicable laws. As staff points out, one of the goals of the GMA is to encourage development in urban areas where adequate public facilities and services exist. The GMA really encourages development in these circumstances. This particular property, as has been pointed out, is between I-5 and Samish Way, already fronts on city services. The property's been zoned as it currently is for I believe 30 years, at least 20, probably more, and there's been no development on this site. This, is due to the restrictive zoning that is in place. This rezone would facilitate development, of a long-standing undeveloped commercial infill site, which is located along a transit route. So, I'd urge you to look at they've put the other criteria in there, and I think they've done a good job to meet the GMA criteria there. The second is the proposed amendment addresses changing circumstances, changing community values, and is consistent with and will help achieve the comprehensive plan goals and policies. The staff correctly points out that there are a number of GMA and comprehensive plan policies regarding infill and development of vacant land. Specifically, encourage infill development on land which remains vacant or underutilized in otherwise built-up areas. That's exactly what we have here. This is a commercially zoned area, that is not developed because of the limiting zoning. Another important fact is, turning now, I'll let staff kind of hit the rest of the criteria and go through those, but this is a planned zone. It will remain a planned zone. Nothing's going to be developed on this property without further review. The staff, points out that potential impacts associated with an individual development proposal will be evaluated through the planned development permitting process, which seeks to lessen development impacts to adjacent areas through site design and mitigating measures. I want to now turn to kind of address just some specific concerns that have been raised and just some specific issues relating to this particular project. The first one's traffic. There's been some public comments that have specifically commented on traffic. We have information from Chris Como on the traffic that I put into the record today, so hopefully you're able to receive it. It was just emailed this afternoon. But really, the information provided by Chris states that there will be no impact in regards to traffic at all for our proposal. And it specifically points out that Samish Way is already a low-volume secondary arterial with 7,000 trips per day. Traffic impact fees would be paid at the time of development to offset, traffic impacts, and then road frontage improvements will be required, which will make the neighborhood better, i.e. sidewalks, lighting. It's going to make it a safer neighborhood area if this property were to be developed. So, any project would increase the pedestrian safety for the area. But again, Chris's information shows that there really is no impact that this proposal, anything that could be built on this site for traffic. They're kind of segueing into the next topic, which is there's a separate proposal that's being processed, which is a rezone of a residentially singled zone area to allow a commercial use. It's a psychologist's office is apparently the proposed use. It's specifically across the street in the church across the street, across Samish Way. I would point out that our proposal is, completely different, as this particular property, ours, is already zoned planned commercial. That's a residential single neighborhood. So, and I think that it's specifically across the other side of the street from Samish Way, which, these are important facts. But that said, there's no reason, and I think you should consider, cumulative impacts of those two proposals together, even though, it's not in front of you today. I think it's easy to look at that potential proposal in conjunction with ours, but there's no reason that you can't consider our proposal today. And again, our proposal is already planned commercial. One of the major issues is traffic. Chris's comments do point out that even development of that site does no effect on traffic. There's really not a traffic issue for these proposals at all. I guess it would be more confusing potentially to have both of those proposals in front of you today. I think it's, you can look at both those proposals, but there's no reason you can't make a decision for us today. And again, there's no cumulative impacts anyway, we would argue. So I want to go back to the fact that this has been vacant for 30 years. The single reason that there's been no interest in development or purchase of this property is the restrictive zoning in place. It makes it virtually impossible to reasonably develop the property. The proposed rezone will broaden the available commercial uses and actually permit residential development. It allows for more appropriate use of the site that is more in character with the neighborhood. Currently, and I'll go through them because I think you'll see how restrictive it is, because there's been comments regarding the negative impacts on the neighborhood character. Well, this rezone would actually allow, much uses that are prohibited. Right now, the current zoning only permits offices, post offices, financial institutions, libraries, computer data services, public uses, churches, recycling centers. That's it. No residential development, no other commercial development at all. So really all we're asking is to expand to just a planned commercial zone with that's what this would do. There's been a lot of concerns from the neighbors regarding retail development of this site. I guess I'd reiterate that the intent of this is not to develop a retail component. It is really to do a mixed-use project of residential with a small commercial component. This is what's consistent in the neighborhood already, and what really the market will bear. Retail is really, on the other side of the freeway, there's tons of retail already there. I don't think the market would bear retail, and that's not the intent of this rezone, is not, even though I want to make it clear, we are removing the non-retail restrictor, but really all that's doing is opening up to the other commercial uses, the planned commercial uses that can be done. And I think that's an important point. Currently as we sit today, any one of those uses I said, including recycling centers, could be developed on the site and could easily generate the similar, if not greater, impacts to the neighborhood compared to what you would see with the change in the rezone. I'm going to turn now just in terms of, there are some limitations on this site that are kind of already imposed. I think it's important in terms of scope in the neighborhood, just because in terms of what's going to happen in retail or otherwise. Really, there's a 35-foot height restriction. It's a relatively small parcel already. There is slopes. There's the freeway buffer, parking requirements, setbacks. When you take into consideration setbacks and the buffer from freeway, there's only 0.77 acres of usable space. This all means that there's not going to be a large-scale project here, and it's going to be consistent. Not to mention, as I already said, there is the planned review that will take place on any proposal that comes forward. So this is just really restricting a draconian zoning that's been in place for a long time. So again, it's a simple change of expanding the uses in existing zone. This rezone in the comp plan will allow infill development on a vacant parcel, which is absolutely consistent with, GMA and comp plan. The criteria for rezone and comprehensive plan amendment have been met. I urge you to adopt the findings and conclusions that have been proposed. Thanks for the consideration. I'm happy to answer any questions or address any other concerns that are raised tonight. So, thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Lisa, you're doing staff?
What's going on here? Okay, well, I'll just keep it pretty brief. Scott covered a lot of the points that I would cover. Again, the request is to remove the non-retail restriction from the commercial plan to non-retail designation, making it a commercial plan zone. This requires amendments to the Samish Neighborhood Plan and the BMC. Once again, this is a type 6 process, meaning that public hearings will be held before the Planning Commission and the City Council, and the City Council makes the final determination. A little background on the project. In June of this year, Planning Commission recommended it for docketing, and in August, City Council approved adding the proposal to the docket. On August 25th, the required pre-application neighborhood meeting was held. There were several concerns raised at that meeting, many of which are reflected in the letters that you've received related to traffic and view impacts possibly, and cumulative impacts of this proposal in addition to the one across the street. There were also some neighbors who expressed support for the project, so I did want to note that. This is a map of the site, and here is Area 9, this red area. Once again, it's approximately 1.7 acres. It's an undeveloped wooded site bordered by the interstate right here and Samish Way, which is a secondary arterial on the other side. The Elks Lodge is located on this site here, and the church is located to the south. 801 Samish, which is the proposal that has been docketed for the rezone from residential single to commercial planned with a non-retail restriction, is located right across the street. And again, you do need to consider the cumulative impacts even though the proposal isn't here today. In fact, their application has not been submitted yet. So the existing use list, I just wanted to highlight that these are the only commercial planned uses that are currently allowed. Offices, which includes post offices, banks, and libraries, consumer credit agencies, computer data services, public uses, churches, and recycling centers. And if the rezone were approved, that would expand the allowable uses to include such uses as retail, personal services, apartments in conjunction with other uses, and several others. The site-specific proposal has not been submitted yet, but they are requesting potentially a multifamily project with a small commercial component, as was stated. Staff does find that the proposal meets the criteria for comprehensive plan amendments and for rezones. And I just wanted to highlight a few of those. They're all listed in the staff report. One of which is that it supports the Comprehensive Plan and Growth Management Act goals, specifically related to infill that's compatible with its surroundings, housing options, and economic development. It addresses changing circumstances in that the surrounding sites, which are primarily zoned single-family residential, have been developed with a mix of uses. I can go back to that. As I stated before, you have the Elks Lodge here, a church further down Samish Way. There's a motel and a school, and this is the interchange is directly north. Once again, the site is located between I-5 and the secondary arterial near the interchange. Staff believes that this project won't adversely affect public health, safety, and welfare, in that the planned use qualifier allows flexibility to develop a project that's compatible with the adjacent uses. Multifamily projects also go through design review process, which is an additional layer of review and public input. Chris Como, our staff's transportation planner, is here tonight. I wanted to point that out. He can speak to the transportation issues as far as the potential project that may go on that site. And transportation concurrency and impact fees will be required with the development proposal. As Scott stated, several of the primary concerns that were submitted in the letters that were received pertain to expansion of the use list to include retail, traffic, other transportation-related issues such as safety along Samish Way, changes in neighborhood character potentially, and cumulative impacts of the Area 9 project with the 801 Samish project. So we will address these in more detail after the public hearing. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take that now. Staff is recommending approval.
Jeff?
I just had a question to clarify something. From what I understand, the council, when this was docketed, they wanted to fold in Elks Lodge within Area 9 into this rezone request. And then when I look at the subject at the top, it's talking about the area, just the one parcel that's south of the Elks Lodge and north of the Baptist Church. And when I look at all the maps in there, it doesn't, like even that one, doesn't include the Elks.
Correct. Okay.
So are we voting on just this parcel or on the larger directive for the city council?
Just Area 9. And what was originally submitted in the original docket application was just basically the square, and this little sliver right here was left out. It's in Area 9, but that little sliver is the only one that isn't owned by the same ownership group as the rest of Area 9. It's owned by Elks Lodge. So that's the sliver that they were referring to.
Oh, so it's not the main building of the Elks Lodge?
It's not the
Sarducci's.
previous Sarducci's, no.
Right, well, that's imprinted on my brain.
Right.
Okay, because that wasn't clear to me as exactly what parcels
Right.
were included.
Sorry, it's just that little sliver there at the north.
And I had another question, and that is, so when you look at this sort of rezone request and you do the analysis on it from a staff perspective on the usability of the property, or I guess on what the highest and best use is, I noticed, and I may be a little mischievous here, but offices such as medical offices are fully permitted under that parcel right now, it would appear to me. They're not. Said offices looked like it was
Wait, let me see.
on the use list.
Offices.
Yeah, and so there seems to be demand for medical offices, at least so we've heard in that particular area. And I'm just kind of curious about when you look at the highest best use and why a parcel hasn't been developed and what kind of demand there is for different types of uses, whether we're actually going to be considering one of those uses for right across the street that's already fully permitted there. And I'm just wondering how that works into your analysis when you look at these things.
Well, I mean, if we rezone it to remove the non-retail restriction, then obviously any of the uses in the planned commercial zone will be allowed, and we can't control what the developer chooses to put on that site once the non-retail restriction is removed. So,
Well, I guess we're being asked to remove the non-retail restriction and expand to multifamily, partly because the property has been sitting there for so long and there's no demand for it, no presumed demand for it under the existing zoning. And I just noticed the irony of the situation. But I was just curious.
right, I understand. And I think if the folks that are working on the 801 Samish proposal were here to talk about their project, they would probably say that one of the reasons they've chosen that site at 801 is there's an existing church there, and they can move right in, make interior renovations, and that's basically all they're planning on doing.
Steve?
Did I hear you correctly mention that this body needs to consider the cumulative effect upon both projects?
Right.
Then how can we go forward with one project and not consider the other project until they formally apply to us?
Well, we know enough about that project through the docketing process that we can talk about it in an informed way as far as what they're proposing to do. At this level, with the rezone and a comp plan amendment, we don't do traffic and impact analyses. We don't do a lot of the review that you would do through the planned permit, through that application process. We work with the criteria that we have, and we can review it in that light.
In page 2 of the packet, it says, per the request of City Council, both the Area 9 and 801 Samish Way proposals will be considered by council during the same meeting.
Mm-hmm.
The potential impacts of both proposals will need to be considered by the Planning Commission.
Yes.
I just don't know how we can sit here and do half of the street and not do the other half and look at the cumulative impact.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, we can provide you with as much information as we know about that project.
Well, they're not here.
Right now.
They're not here.
There are some folks in the audience that with 801. I don't know if they're signed up to speak later, but they are here. And I've been working with them for quite some time now through the docketing process, and I can provide you with any information that I
Yeah,
might
but
have.
they're not here to present anything. That's what I'm saying. If whatever action we take tonight, we're just doing it on one side of the street. We're doing it on the west side.
Yes.
I think we should consider the west side and both impacts on the total rezones. That's my feeling on this thing.
Garrett?
I guess my question is, is this the direction of the city council to evaluate both proposals? It seems really unusual to me to do that. These are separate applications. This is a land use application for a specific, for a rezone and a comp plan amendment.
Mm-hmm.
Why are we even asked to look at these in conjunction with each other? It makes no sense.
Well, I mean, the annual docket process is meant to do that, is to look at all of the proposals at one time during the year so that you can see the cumulative impacts. However, the actual rezone and comp plan amendments don't necessarily come to you all at once or to the city council, but since these are across the street, they would like to see them together. They didn't necessarily say that you needed to see them together.
Well, what we know about the other proposal on Samish is that they're not intending to, they're just changing the use of the building. They're not intending to do any development. The property's built out. I just think I think we have to be careful when we look at them together. I mean, the overall intent and what's happening in the neighborhood is important to think about, but in my opinion, these aren't related.
Do you want to move on to the public hearing and then ask more questions later? Or do you have more now?
Are there any more questions for the proponent or staff? If not, then we'll open the public hearing, and we should have a sign-up sheet. Ta-dam. Look at there. Richard Connaboy is the only one who signed up. I would hope so.
Good evening. My name's Dick Connaboy. I live at 165 South 46th Street, and I'm also on the Samish board, but I'm not speaking for the board tonight. I want to point out, first of all, on I think it's page 3 of the staff report about changing circumstances, and it states that the Samish Neighborhood Plan was adopted in 1980, and since that time we've had all these things happening, and these other properties, the Elks Club came into being and whatnot. The Samish Neighborhood Plan was revised, I think it was 2007, and all these properties, the way they sit right now, that's the way they were. And whoever owned this property, and I think it's still the same owner that we're talking about tonight, thought didn't think to do anything with the property then when we were revising the plan. Nobody came forward and objected, and the Samish neighborhood approved that this property that you're considering tonight would remain commercial, non-retail. And that was about 6 years ago, 7 years ago. So we don't have a great changing circumstance at that end of Samish Way. Next, with respect to the cumulative effects, I would ask that you do not take action on this evening for the simple reason that there are other factors that need to be considered, and namely that, and I noticed that among the folks here on the Planning Commission, there's several people who actually do real estate, and they know what effect adjoining properties have on adjoining properties. So what's going to happen here, or what could happen, and I think you need to think out 10 or 20 years, in spite of the intentions of these folks or the intentions of the psychology group, we will have two commercially zoned properties right across from one another, whereas we only have one now. We also have the Elks Club and the Community Baptist Church. Now, the Elks Club, it's still a going concern, but I don't know how much of a future they have. And I certainly don't know what future they would have if all of a sudden because of the rezones next to them, their property suddenly looks really, really good to a developer, and especially somebody who might want to rezone that property to commercial. Well, you already got two down there. Why not do another one? Similarly with the Baptist Church. That's still a going concern, but it's not exactly a thriving church community. And they've got a couple acres there, I think at least. And with the value of that property, they may well take a look at that, take their cash and run, and go settle in another church or another spot. So I would ask you to think out 10 or 20 years, and I would also ask you to wait until you hear the Samish proposal, the 801 Samish proposal, and also to take into consideration that when these commercial properties they're approved as commercial, that's it. Their intents may be fine, but between the time it gets approved and the building starts, accidents happen, partners in real estate have fallouts, there's all sorts of things that can happen. So it's not so cut and dried as it's being pointed out here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dick. Anyone else wish to speak on this? You get about approximately 3 minutes, and we hope that you don't just reiterate what Dick just said.
I would never reiterate what Dick just said. Ron Judd, 817 Samish. I'd like to reiterate what Dick just said and also add a couple things. My driveway is one driveway down and across Samish Way, the racetrack, from the property in question. Our other two property owners off of that same driveway are here tonight. The people directly across the street are not here. But to hear anyone connected with the city or claiming to represent the city say that there will be no traffic impact from this development is comical. I mean, Samish Way, if you think about capacity, has capacity, and that's part of the problem. When I take a left turn into my driveway going up Samish Way to get to my house, it's one of those cringe and look in the rearview mirror situations because the traffic on that street is so fast that you literally take your life in your hands to walk across the street to get your mail, okay? You're talking about adding two developments, one a commercial unknown mystery project, but it'll be developed well, we're supposed to believe, on one side, and on the other side we have an operating psychology clinic with about 9 or 10 practitioners. Okay, that's more traffic. It's a lot more traffic. It's a lot more people turning both directions off of that road in the same exact place. No center turn lane, no impact. Sorry, I don't buy that. As to the criteria, I just note that there is so much trust here from the planning department. The criterion that have all been met include one that says adequate public facilities and services are or would be available to serve the development allowed by the proposed zone. And if you read the staff's response to that, they say, oh, well, there might be this problem of having water. There may not be enough flow. We may not be able to, we'll have to address that later, but then it says the criteria has been met. Well, based on what? We don't know anything about this proposal. We've been told that it's a small retail component. What does that mean? Nobody knows what that means. Somebody from the staff just said and admitted the city has no control about what the developer brings to the table once this zoning change has been made. The other criterion that's been met is it will not materially detrimental, it will not be materially detrimental to uses or property in the immediate vicinity of the subject property. Okay, well, that's my property. I'm in the immediate vicinity. In my mind, the removal of the retail restriction in itself, ipso facto, is detrimental to my property in the immediate vicinity, especially when I don't know what's going to go there. Okay? It's cart before the horse. If we knew, it's ironic we're talking about what we don't know about the psychology proposal across the street. We know way more about that at this point than we do about this one, which is up for action. Okay, so I, at the risk of being repetitive, would repeat that it's critical to look at this in a big picture, not only with these 2 properties, but with 4 properties in that one block that provide a buffer zone between my neighborhood and the Samish world. So thanks for taking that into consideration.
Thank you, Ron. Anyone else wish to speak to us?
Good evening. My name is Laird McCaddy. I own the property at 819 Samish Way, and I share the driveway with Ron and Chuck. And for anyone who ever has to do any kind of yard work down on Samish Way, you take your life in your hands by running your mower along the Samish Way. There are no sidewalks, no bike lanes, anything. That's really important to take into consideration. And also, I'd like to have you refer to Exhibit C, which is the Samish Neighborhood Plan, Area 9. It talks about the current restriction on height development would be 20 feet at the Samish Way property line. If it goes strictly commercial planned without this restriction, who knows what kind of, what's the height limit? Is it 35 feet, which I heard someone say earlier? Or can they go, 100 feet? So that's going to affect any kind of views that the neighbors along Samish Way have, or the neighbors above Samish Way in the Ridgemont neighborhood have. Also, on page 35 of the same, or of the proposal for this property, section 4, comprehensive neighborhood plan amendment application, it says explain why the amendment is needed. And I read this several times and I'm still confused by why it's needed. It says the proposed amendment is needed because conditions have changed in the area since the adoption of the non-retail use qualifier for Area 1, and it is no longer an appropriate restriction on uses for the development of this property. The non-retail designation was intended to limit high-traffic retail-type uses, which at the time were considered to be inappropriate for the area. And then it goes on to say, this is still true today. However, the non-retail use qualifier restricted the available uses for the property too severely, limiting the property to a short list of office-type uses. Office-type uses are also not appropriate for this property and have not developed in the area over 20-plus years. There has never been a demand in this location for office-type uses. In the meantime, adjacent and surrounding properties have developed with predominantly residential uses. An appropriate development for this property would be a multifamily use with a small commercial component. The commercial plan designation without a non-retail use qualifier would permit this type of development and would facilitate a best use of this property. If the proposed amendment is not approved, then the property will most likely continue to remain undeveloped due to the restriction to office-type uses. So that's kind of confusing to me. It says it's approved for office-type uses, but then it says it's going to remain undeveloped because of the lack of or the restriction of office-type uses. So, you know, I'm really against changing the zoning restriction on this property, especially in light of what's happening across the street with 801 Samish Way. I don't think anyone's looked at traffic considerations, safety, crime. I mean, all those things. When we bought that property, I'll swear it was just like living in a park. You know, we're surrounded by trees. We had a view of the ocean or of the Puget Sound. It was a wonderful place to live. Now, you know, we're probably not going to keep that property if these two properties are going to convert their zoning. So, thank you.
Thank you, Laird. Anyone else wish to speak? Seeing nobody jumping out of their chair and racing down, we'll close the public hearing. And we will have, does staff want to do response first or proponent?
Sure, I have a few points I'd like to comment on. Yes, the height limit is 35 feet when within 100 feet of the site plan boundary lying adjacent to a residential general use type, which it has on each side. So basically the height limit is 35 feet. And then the other comment regarding the cumulative impacts and other sites along Samish Way converting to commercial. Strip commercial is not something that's supported in our comp plan, and we would look at each proposal on an individual basis, but generally we don't foresee that happening in that stretch of Samish Way. And then if Chris Como wouldn't mind coming up and just briefly talking about some of the preliminary analysis he's done for transportation impacts, I'd appreciate that.
Good evening, everybody. Chris Como, Transportation Planner with Bellingham Public Works. I would like to clarify one thing. The applicant mentioned that I had stated there would be no traffic impacts. I didn't say that. What I said is there are not significant transportation impacts in the sense that it would cross thresholds that we have for conducting things like traffic studies. Any development here is going to be subject to every other development regulation we have, like any other development. We look at it through the lens of transportation concurrency. We will look at the trip count, depending on what is proposed here. I've been asked to gauge what the trip count might be based on a couple of scenarios. What I've just passed out here is some information about various things regarding transportation. As Lisa has mentioned several times, Samish Way is a secondary arterial. The current traffic count, which was done in September, is about 6,200 vehicles. On the second page, you'll see a map showing traffic volumes for various arterials in the south part of Bellingham. But here I've given you some examples of nearby arterials. Lincoln Street, just north of this area, between Samish and Lakeway, carries about 12,000 vehicles a day. So this is a much lower number than what you see just a little farther north. There's lots of additional capacity on Samish Way. Capacity is only one aspect of what we look at when we think about transportation. I've also got some Speed information here from the traffic counts that were conducted. The average speed, well, the posted speed is 35 miles an hour. The average speed is 38 and 37. And then in engineering terms, we look at something called 85th percentile, and that's a little bit higher at 43 and 44, but it's within the 10 mile per hour range of what you look at for speed limit issues. That's not to say that there aren't people driving faster than that. There's always a few bad apples, and the speed limits are set to try to control that, but really it's law enforcement that does the job of controlling people speeding on our streets. What I was asked to look at was some scenarios, one of which was 60 apartments and one of which was 75 apartments, worst case scenarios, neither of which would trip thresholds for traffic studies. And we always give full credit for development that exists. I was under the impression that the Elks Lodge was included here, but it's not. This is vacant land, so even so, those don't trip the thresholds for traffic studies. Even when you look across the street at what the psychologists are proposing to do, after we give credit for the church that's there, and what they want to come do is renovate the building, and they're going to spend a significant amount of money to do that. They're going to have to pay transportation impact fees. They're making a pretty big investment. I don't think they're going away anytime soon, but their trip count is 15 trips or less. Even when combined with what I was asked to look at on this particular parcel, combined, it doesn't trip the threshold for traffic studies. So when I'm saying there's not a significant transportation issue here, it's through that kind of lens that I'm looking at it. I've also provided you with some collision data for the last 6 years. The section that we're talking about right at Ridgemont Way, there's been 2 collisions in the last 6 years. Both of them were drivers hitting fixed objects. There's some other information on this sheet just to give you some reference points as to what it looks like on other parts of the corridor. And again, from a safety standpoint, looking at vehicle collisions, this is not something that really sets off alarm bells for us in terms of, having problems. New development will be required to make street frontage improvements on the arterial street. That would include curbs, gutters, and sidewalks. And if bike lanes are called for, which they are on this section of arterial, that would include bike lanes. It's difficult to look at a section of arterial like this. It's an old section of Pacific Highway. It was built to carry automobiles. It was built to carry automobiles at higher speeds. It's an old concrete street, and yes, the edges are not in great shape. The city would love to change that. We don't have the money to change that, and that's why when development comes in, they're expected to finish the street as our plans call for. And that's essentially all I have to share. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Jeff?
I had a couple. I was familiar with the history of the Pacific Highway and 99 history of that, and I'm just wondering if there's any lingering state involvement in funding transportation improvements or anything, or have they completely written it off and it's a city street now?
It's a city street. It's not a state highway any longer.
Okay, well then the other question is, it's just my impression that the traffic's been building significantly as there starts to be more development on the fringe of the city, including all the way up to U Street. Everything's channeling in Samish Way. Do you have well, that's opinion, I guess not fact, but there seems to be a buildup of traffic, and I'm wondering if you have a sense of, say, what the underlying rate of increase on traffic is based on all this other development that's happening and how much this contributes to that. Because I'm kind of getting the gut level feeling that there are potentially hundreds and hundreds of new trips being generated by all the development out towards Galbraith and U Street, and this is a fairly small number of a total that's really going to be building over the next 10 to 20 years. But I don't know if the city's done that kind of analysis.
Well, we do modeling analysis when we do our comprehensive planning, and I guess the simple answer would be we do expect more traffic in the future if we're successful with infill development and getting people to live and work in Bellingham. Bellingham is a regional center, so we actually take more traffic than what we generate locally. We get a lot of people coming in from outside the city because of the jobs, the hospital, the universities, everything. So there will be more traffic in the future, and it's very likely there will be more traffic on Samish Way. But as I stated, there's plenty of capacity on Samish Way to carry the traffic. all development's going to create new traffic, but when we get development proposals, we look at what the potential impacts of each and every proposal is. I can tell you that, based on the map here, you could see that in 2010, there were 7,100 vehicles counted on this section of Samish Way, but just in September, we counted 6,200. So from a trend standpoint, it's not actually an increase. It doesn't mean it's an exact science, but the trend doesn't appear to be a drastic increase.
Right. Okay, well, for a while there in the 80s and 90s, it seemed like a residential street, but it's always been an arterial, and there's been that potential there, and so I just was curious of what the backstory was, but.
Other questions, concerns? No? How about, I just have a stupid question. What is the threshold for a traffic report on?
So it's not a simple answer, but the general rule of thumb is if there's a project that's producing 50 PM peak hour trips, and PM peak refers to the evening rush hour, standard procedure in transportation planning. But we look at any situation plus or minus 10%. If there's a nearby intersection that's at or below the thresholds that we've adopted in the city for level of service or delay, then we'll tell people, I'm sorry, but that's, it's already a problem. We need you to analyze this and look at what your project's impacts are going to do to this particular intersection. Or if there's a public safety issue that we're very concerned about, we'll also ask people to analyze that. But like I said, with the information that I have available and what I've been asked to look at and consider in terms of what the traffic impacts would be, neither of these rise to the point where it crosses those thresholds and we would require a traffic study.
Okay. Would a traffic study also would not be required if we considered the 801 property? Is that correct?
That's correct. The psychologists I'm expecting them to generate 15 trips or less after credit is given for the existing church use. And then with this proposal, even when I looked at a worst case scenario of what somebody said was 75 apartments combined with the psychology proposal, that's not going to produce over 50 trips.
Okay. Thank you. Scott, did you want a chance to?
I would, thank you. I'll be really brief. This cumulative impacts issue keeps coming up. I guess I would point out that these proposals are significantly different. We are already zoned planned commercial, and the impact, so really, when you look at it, it's not a significant impact change from what we have already to what it could be. There's no reason that we can look at our proposal and say, what are our impacts? And yes, you can look at across the street with the knowledge you have now and say, how is that going to affect it? But again, we're just changing we could build offices now that would already generate those impacts. We're just changing the zoning. I'd also point out that there is no application. We don't know when that proposal will be in front of you. There's no reason that you can't. If you do, you'll have heard our proposal, made a recommendation on our proposal, but they're being batched together as is required to go to the city council. They're going to read all of this together. You can do your analysis in their recommendations and findings, and you could do something at that time once you hear the second proposal. But I don't see any reason, Again, our proposal is just a rezone. We are already planned commercial. The impacts are already there. So I guess that's how I would address the cumulative impacts. Certainly, there is a project across the street. We know it. I think we can all you've all looked at other projects and been able to visualize what's supposed to happen. That can happen tonight. If something changes when you hear their proposal, then you can put it in their findings of fact. And again, theirs is a much larger change than ours is, going from single-family residential to planned commercial. Ours is. So that's, unless you have specific questions on cumulative impacts, I think they are being addressed. The fact that, Chris's analysis looked into them, that's a huge part of the cumulative impacts would be traffic. That's been looked at. Staff says they looked at it. Lisa said she's talked to them and knows what they're going to be proposing. Her staff report addresses that, and they're still recommending approval. So I think those are all important points that we can look at. I know I said I'd be brief, so. I guess in terms of safety, I mean, some of the issues that have been raised will be addressed when this property is developed. I think, you know, the development of this property would actually help with the road, the sidewalks, the lighting, and all these issues that have been, some of these issues that have been raised. In terms of, give me one second. I guess, you know, that's all I've got. I really wanted to address the cumulative impacts portion, but if you have any questions, there were a number of other comments that I'm happy to address. So, thanks.
Thank you, Scott. Okay. Are there any clarifications or questions? Yeah.
No clarification. The whole concept of accumulative impacts I find to be very interesting to grapple with, because where do they stop? You know, if it's right across the street, that's one thing. Is it, you know, half a mile down the way? It gets to be very complicated, and either you have to take them all into consideration, I would think, or you don't. You just treat each project as it comes down the way, and that's difficult. If we're, like I say, if we're supposed to be valuing accumulated impacts, then where does that stop? You know, 50 here, 50 there, 50 whatever, reaches a point. Maybe staff can make a comment on this and kind of help clarify. But, so, Samish, and I live near here, not that I have a huge concern, and that's not why I'm saying this, but with the changes that could happen over the next several years, no one of them is going to reach a trigger, but they all accumulatively will create a major impact. And I'm not sure, all of a sudden occurred to me tonight, how do we as planning commissioners deal with that sort of thing when we're asked to deal with a particular project and we need to look at it in the bigger picture? So I'm asking that question.
Well, I think when we talk about cumulative impacts, staff does, related to this project. We're talking about this project and the 801 Samish project because they were both docketed in the 2014-2015 amendment process. So when we talk about cumulative impacts, we're talking about the projects that are on the docket for this coming year.
So you're not looking at a far-reaching kind of philosophical comment?
No.
Yeah, okay.
Steve?
I think still got to go back to page 2. It says, per the request of the City Council, both the Area 9 and 801 Samish proposals will be considered by Council during the same meeting. It doesn't make any difference what we do tonight. It's going to sit there and gather dust until 801 submits theirs. Is this not correct? Why don't we just wait till we get 801 and do them both together?
Well, my colleague here just brought up a good point. What if 801 decides not to submit? They have that option.
Well, then, it's still, then at that time, move forward. But until then, City Council wants them both to be considered at the same time. So whatever we do tonight, it's not going to make any difference. Why don't we wait until we have them both presented, look at them both, like the two impacts we say they could have. I'm not saying that either are going to be turned down, either are going to be approved. But at least we've done what City Council has asked us to do, and that is look at both of them.
Garrett?
I could comment on that direction from council. The way I read it is the potential impacts of both proposals will need to be considered by both the Planning Commission and City Council. So whether that's done independently or together, I think we can do both that. We can look at the impacts of this specific rezone, and we can look at the impacts of the rezone request for 801, and we could adopt those into our findings when that comes before us. If it doesn't come, then there's nothing to talk about, and that could happen. So I don't think we stall the process on something that we don't know is going to happen. What we have before us, we can make a recommendation on this. Another comment that I have, a lot of the concerns that we've heard in testimony and received in written testimony aren't necessarily, in my opinion, about a zoning change. They're just about change. And this proposal isn't about a specific change or a specific project. It's a rezone. It's changing the qualifier from a commercial and taking out the non-retail provision. That's all it is. So traffic impacts, that has to do with change, has to do with development, has to do with something being built. All these concerns, you know, need to be taken in context of what we're looking at. And what we're looking at is a real specific rezone criteria, and we could go through them, you know, and discuss the merits of that criteria. I think it's important to stay on task with what we're really looking at here tonight.
Jeff?
I guess my perspective on it is that the transportation impacts were brought up by a lot of the letters and the public comment, but that's one facet of this overall project, and these are two completely different projects to me. One is changing a commercial restricted to a generalized commercial multifamily in an area that's bounded by the freeway and Pacific Highway, Samish Way. That wedge has different characteristics than the separate policy issue of what do you do with old churches in single-family zones? You know, Bellingham's littered with churches in single-family zones that could be reused for something else, but haven't been typically. And, you know, there's a precedent there. There's a lot of thorny issues tied into what you do with old church properties. I'd hate to blend the two, assuming that they have to be discussed together, when really the only overlap between the two is, in fact, the very limited transportation impacts on Samish Way. And if we tried to save those for one meeting, it's a very big topic. I think would be ping-ponging everywhere between is multifamily, you know, appropriate for commercial uses? Is it appropriate for that specific site? And then you bounce into, well, what do you do with old churches? So I think I'd like to keep these separate for the time being and deal with this at hand and then see what comes down the pike as far as the church issue.
Phyllis?
I would just like to say also that it feels better to me now to keep these separate, because in any attempt to, in either time or basic philosophy to link them together just makes it a very awkward situation. So I'm thinking that the idea of what staff is proposing seems reasonable. Thank you.
Anyone else? Well, then maybe we should entertain a motion so that we can actually do some arm wrestling.
I move to adopt the findings, facts, and conclusions in the 1120 staff report to remove the non-retail component and the commercial zoning.
Second.
And the comp plan amendment.
Hey, Garrett, I did want to note, in talking with Scott tonight, we were looking through the findings, and a lot of times we copy and paste from the staff report, and throughout the findings it says staff finds, and so I wanted to make sure it was okay with you if we did just editorial, change that to planning commission finds.
Well, that's the way it should be.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. We're going to make those changes before it's signed, so.
Okay, we've got a motion on the floor. Any second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Discussion. I guess first off, I'm going to say that several years ago, my partner did a very brief look at feasibility on this site for residential, and nothing came of that at all, just to get that out in the air. Who wants to go first? Oh, good.
Yeah, I'm actually going to say something. I would definitely back up what Garrett was saying, in that I think it's hard. No one really likes change. No one wants it in their own backyard, and I can relate to that. Living downtown, there's a lot of stuff I don't want to see, and, you know, it's a struggle. However, you know, I also think there's some benefits when you look at improved sidewalks and lighting that helps safety, that helps quality of life in a neighborhood. So those are some things that I'm also looking at. And that it is a, you know, unfortunately, it is close to I-5 and it is Samish Way, which, you know, is a popular place for business, and it's the old highway. So I think those factors play into it for me in considering this.
Steve?
Yeah, I particularly don't have any objections to any of the reasons to approve this, but my problem is with this of moving ahead, letting it sit, gather dust until City Council gets 801 proposal. So I will be voting no on this motion.
Garrett?
Looking at the rezone criteria, I think the situations, you know, the circumstances have changed in Bellingham as a whole, not only in the Samish neighborhood, but the greater Bellingham. I think anytime that you have underutilized property for a significant period of time, it's not good for the community. You know, it doesn't provide any kind of tax base. It doesn't provide any kind of impact fees that help improve streets. You know, tax base from development helps pay for parks, trails, sewer, storm, rain gardens, all the amenities that we like and that we use and that we benefit from. So I think the nature of that zoning tells us that it's not right. And there is too many restrictions because it's been like that for 20 years. It is a commercial zone property. It has not been developed, and that's not good for anybody. So that's, as I look through, you know, kind of the design, the criteria of the rezone, is it in the best welfare, you know, of the public to see that property rezone? I would say it is. So that's my thoughts.
Jeff?
I actually have a follow-up question for staff. One of the things that I'm struggling with is I can understand some of the grief over having a retail component there and looking at where your retail base is right now versus pulling over on the other side of the freeway. And I'm wondering, to what extent is including a very small retail component an expediency to just change from one commercial to another commercial, where most of the money to be made is in multifamily, or whether, and so you have to have that retail designation, or whether you drop the retail designation and you basically say, this is a residential area and multifamily is what it should be. And I'm just wondering how that came together, because what I've heard so far is that, well, retail's not the intent of the project. It's just a very small piece of it. It's just there. It's nothing that's going to be driving the project. And the impression I'm getting is that multifamily is the plan. So why not just zone it multifamily and actually change that so that it stays residential on that side?
Well, I think you'd probably have to ask the applicant for starters, but I mean, from staff's perspective, the planned commercial zone provides the public with more opportunities for input and also for that compatibility review. It provides a lot more flexibility and as well as the design review component. So for us to make this shift from removing the non-retail restriction to opening up the uses isn't that much of a shift, whereas going from a commercial planned zone to a multifamily zone is a much bigger zone change.
But aren't there a lot of criteria in the multifamily for planned, essentially planned developments, where you have you have the design review, and you have a lot of those other factors of control from the city's perspective?
Right.
Or?
There's the multifamily design review would kick in regardless, but the planned process is an additional layer that has the height restrictions and several other. Chris could probably speak to that more than I could. He deals with development projects quite a bit.
Well, I don't need to go into the minutia. And I don't want to derail things. It strikes me that retail is one of those sticking points where it really is going to stick out like a sore thumb, because right now along that stretch there's an old motel from the Pacific Highway days, there's a Montessori, there's a couple churches. There's not really any retail, and there's, it's just this different thing than potentially putting in a multifamily development, and it seems like it's a little tangled up there.
Yeah, Mr. Swanson, could you speak to why this particular thing was directed this way? We've got a list like that. Could not the non-retail qualifier still be in there and just simply add residential to a list like that and have the result be no retail and, as maybe a small office kind of component to a residential?
Great question. I guess I'd first start off to say that Lisa did a good job of explaining the flexibility and design review process that comes with the planned commercial, which is one of the reasons, we like it. Plus, it's an easier shift. It already is planned commercial, so we're just shifting to, it allows that flexibility. But in regards to your specific question, I don't think, as an applicant's proponent here, we would object to something that you're proposing. As I've said, there really is, I think analysis have been done that retail would not work very well here anyway. I don't think there would be an objection if you wanted to. And I guess the proposal I would say is maybe, and I've been giving it some thought as you guys have been talking about it, but the special regulation section of the area would be revised. I think we would keep the non-retail use qualifier in place, but instead of having the special regulations just list those 6 limiting uses, we could open it up and just say retail use types are prohibited, but then everything else in the planned commercial would be allowed, and that would be consistent with, what the applicant's desires and needs for the property would be. So, you've raised a good question, and I think that would be an easy change and something that of course, you always want flexibility because you never know where things are going, but that's certainly an option that we would consider. So,
yeah, I wasn't proposing anything. I was just asking the question.
Well, I guess I'm following up to say that retail is not, at this point, really a consideration for this project. So, I mean, we said it before, and I'm going to the point to say if that's something the Planning Commission wants to consider, that they don't want to see retail in this particular location because of impacts, take it off the table. Just open up the rest of those. I mean, look at those 6 uses. It's very limiting. Just open up the rest of the planned commercial, which provides the flexibility. So, again, I would prefer that we don't go that direction. I think, let the market decide, make it a planned commercial zone. I don't think there's going to be retail there anyway. But, so, I'm not sure if I specifically answered an earlier question. We kind of jumped into.
Well, that's at the core of that is, I think one of the things we're talking about here is, are we going to be supporting the leakage of retail across the freeway down Sandwich? Because again, if you look out 20 years in the future, there may be a lot of additional rezones happening, and it may be less amenable as a single-family neighborhood. And I think there's a very clear choice we have on, is the retail urban village core for that sort of thing going to be on Sandwich Way on the other side of the freeway, or is it going to start coming down here? And I wanted to ask that question because I think that is on the table here.
Other comments, questions from the commission? No. Well,
could we get a staff response on how that works?
Sure. If retail is a significant sticking point for the commission, there is a simple way to make the change. I think that the applicant seeks and address that issue. And Chris, do you want to explain how we would do that?
Basically, it'd be very similar that non-retail would continue in its place, but all other planned commercial uses would be allowed, including residential uses. So that would basically address the retail issue.
So you would keep the non-retail restriction, take out this list, so that the planned commercial uses would be allowed, including residential. And I think that would address the concern about retail being introduced on this side of the freeway.
Now, just speaking personally, if I was an adjoining neighbor, I'd sure love to see the recycling centers still on that prohibited, or stricken off of the allowed uses. I mean, but that's just me.
So a quick question. If the property is zoned and used for multifamily use, residential use, and we take out the retail aspect, does that mean they can't have a little store downstairs if the people want to buy some milk or bread right at their house? I mean, are we eliminating that option to create that type of environment where people can buy what they want where they live?
Yes, you are eliminating that option, but you need quite a population to support something like that. And so it's not just, 40 to 60 units here that will be able to keep that business in business. You need additional population. So really retail, is it feasible at this location? That's a good question. Another thing to consider is the residential. Right now, planned commercial residential is only allowed in conjunction with other permitted uses. So whether it's a office is the commercial component that's added to it, or one of the other. Keep in mind that we have approved these in other areas. There's two of them right off of 32nd Street behind Hagen's that required a commercial component. Since those have been built, one of them about 10 years ago, another one about 7 years ago, the commercial space has never been filled. So sometimes it's not a really good idea. And so I would, maybe as another option that you could add that residential is permitted outright. So it doesn't require a commercial component or a mixed use component.
Thanks, Phyllis.
I would just say obligating somebody to put something in that doesn't make financial sense just doesn't seem to be the right thing to be doing either. So I would hate to be forcing somebody into doing something that we know is not probably going to work, or prohibiting them from doing something that makes sense. And so I would lean more toward the broader brush view with what can be done with the property than to try it. And because it's going to, what I'm understanding is any project would have to come back for review in specific application. Is that not correct? So, I mean, they're not just free to run wild after they get out of here tonight. I mean, there's all sorts of other opportunities to offer guidance to whatever design comes. So I'm getting much more comfortable with the proposal. Thank you.
Garrett?
Could you revisit that again? So with the proposed change to commercial planned, is it required to have a commercial component in a multifamily building? That is?
Yes, it reads that residential uses in conjunction with other permitted uses, when in conjunction with other permitted uses.
Well, but it could be an office or any of the other uses on the list. It doesn't have to be a retail.
But it brings up a good point, because you see structures just down on Lincoln Street that have had vacant spaces for a long period of time because they've been forced to add that component, and it's forcing the hand. It doesn't really make sense.
That's another good example of that location on Lincoln Street.
Yeah, but again, that's not what the applicant is requesting. So unless they wanted to comment on that particular restriction, I don't know that it's our place to make that change, because that hasn't been part of the public comment or that specific restriction.
What I would add is that if you allowed residential permitted outright, they still retain the option to, add a mixed use It just doesn't obligate them to do it.
Yeah, well, then in that case, I mean, I think that's absolutely a good amendment to make to the findings of fact. I'd be, I'd make that an amendment to the motion if I can do that, to my own motion.
I believe you can.
I'd like to do that. I'd like to make that residential uses permitted outright as a amendment to the motion on the table.
Do we have a second on that?
Second.
All right. It's been moved and seconded that residential uses outright be allowed in this zone. Any discussion more on the amendment? No? Well, then we'll vote on it. All those in favor of the amendment, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? 6-0. Any more discussion on the motion itself? Nobody's standing up. Okay. Well, then, we'll call the question. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
No.
5-1. Motion is passed. Okay. Old and new business, first meeting in January, we're going to select a chair and vice chair for 2015. Just heads up. Next scheduled meeting is December 4th with a hearing consideration of the draft growth and development alternatives for the 2016 comprehensive plan update. Anything as far as the director's
I
report?
just would mention, with regard to that December 4th meeting, it's really for information only. We're not seeking any action by the commission at that time. We're going to present a number of alternatives for accommodating growth that we will be studying as we update the comprehensive plan, and we want to get your thoughts about that, but we're not asking for any action. We'll come back to you probably early next year with a more formal seeking direction from you and from the council. At that time, this is really for information only. When you get the packet, you may already have it, or you'll have it soon. If you have any questions, be sure and give me a call or give Lisa a call. We'd be happy to sit down with you and talk about any of the information that's in that packet.
So for my homework, I don't have to read the entire comprehensive plan by next, or
No, you just
next
have to
meeting.
read the very short packet that we are presenting to you.
Okey doke. Anything else? Anything for the good of the order? Then this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.